Good morning and welcome to yet another session of the NPTEL course, The History of English Language and Literature. We continue our discussion of the rise of the novel, and we also begin noticing that the long 18th century was dominated by the dynastical rule of different rulers. It was not the reign of a single monarch. We notice that it was ruled by William III in the beginning, then Queen Anne, George I, George II and George III. So, overall it was also dominated by the House of Hanover. So, having said that, let us continue to locate the historical significance of the novel in the 18th century. Novel as a historical event, it does have a lot of literary as well as social value, some of which we had begun to look at in the previous session as well. And this was primarily characterized by the growth of a reading public, which also included a number of women. It was a hitherto unknown kind of a fact in history, given that female literacy was much lower, and also the access to reading material by women was quite limited until that point of time. But from the 18th century onwards, with the various forms of newer kinds of dissemination of knowledge and dissemination of books, we find that women had an increasing access to reading material and especially novel. And we also notice that since women were not permitted to be a part of any other kind of amusement activity or any other kind of entertainment, for instance, they were not allowed to go and watch the plays in public, we find them taking a lot of comfort and a lot of interest in this particular activity of reading novels. And some of the historians are also of the opinion that the novel reading probably increased as the reading of plays declined, primarily because the 18th century also saw a decline in the production and the writing and the staging of drama in general. So, so there was a perfect kind of an ambience in place for novel reading to emerge as a popular leisure praxis. But however, there was also another moral and ethical element to it. There was an increasing moral panic about the newfound interest that women had, particularly on reading novels. There were a lot of men of good standing who were of the opinion that the access to novel would corrupt the young women of England considerably. For example, if you take a look at one of those editorials that appeared in a magazine of those times named Sylph, you would be surprised at the kind of opinions that people of learned stature held against women reading in public. If you allow me to read a paragraph from this particular write-up: women of every age, of every condition, contract and retain a taste for novels. The depravity is universal. My sight is everywhere offended by these foolish yet dangerous books. I find them on the toilet of fashion and in the work bag of the seamstress, in the hands of the lady who lounges on the sofa and of the lady who sits at the counter. From the mistresses of nobles, they descend to the mistresses of snuff shops, from the belles who read them in town to the chits who spell them in the country. I have actually seen mothers in miserable garrets crying for the imaginary distress of an heroine, while their children were crying for bread, and the mistress of a family losing hours over a novel in the parlour, while her maids, in emulation of the example, were similarly employed in the kitchen. I have seen a scullion wench with a dishcloth in one hand and a novel in the other, sobbing over the sorrows of a Julia or a Jemima. So, this was a popular opinion of at least some of the learned men of those times, but nevertheless we do find that novel continued to have continued to enjoy a lot of popularity among women as well as men in the 18th as well as in the subsequent centuries. There is a general assumption that four factors together contributed to this event of the rise of the novel in the 18th century, which was an immense increase in literacy. Secondly, a thriving book market, which also ensured that the books reached every nook and corner of the country. And thirdly, there was enough and more access for novels, no matter where you were placed and no matter which class you belonged to or which gender you belonged to. So, this was a fairly new thing, because books until that point of time were extremely expensive and it was not affordable for everyone. So, this access also led to the emergence of a new reading public and the thriving of the genre. And fourthly, this was also the time when an increasing sense of privacy was developing in the society. And novel reading obviously also included the aspects of privacy. So the development of this equality also led to the emergence of a novel in the 18th century. And in terms of the technique and craft of writing, we find that the novel was not limited to the cramping principles of classicism. So there is more freshness, and the writers are also able to work independently, freer from the many tenets that governed the other forms of writing. And it was also the result of the democratic movement that was thriving in England during the 18th century. And that since novel did not emerge as an aristocratic genre like many other forms of writing did. And in fact, about the success of Pamela, Lord Morley, who was one of the influential writers of those times, he remarked, it was a landmark of a great social, no less than a great literary transition, when all England went mad with enthusiasm over the trials, the virtues, the triumphs of a rustic lady's maid. So it was a newer kind of trend which was catching up in England then. And this novel also offered a wider scope than drama, because this was the typical art form which lent itself to the introspective and analytical modern world, and that's what England was transforming into by the end of the 18th century. Having already taken a look at the life and work of Samuel Richardson, it's time to take a look at the second most important writer of this period, Henry Fielding, who lived from 1717 to 1754. Unlike Richardson, he had a fairly early start. He also had a long training in drama. He had started off his career by writing plays. However, he is also recorded in history as a notorious dramatist, and his plays are not of much significance. He also in that sense had the advantage of having had a good preliminary preparation in terms of techniques of writing. So in many ways he was unlike Richardson. Nevertheless, Richardson did not have a good opinion about him. It said that Richardson had pronounced a judgment on Fielding's writings by considering it as wretchedly low and dirty. Fielding is one of those writers who derived much mileage from the success of Richardson's Pamela. So in that sense, though his work was quite influenced by Richardson's Pamela, though in a very different way, we do find that he also reaped an equal amount of success. Fielding's first experiment in novel was a direct offshoot from Richardson's Pamela, which was a huge and instant success in England in 1740. While whole of England was in raptures over Pamela and its success, Fielding did not share this enthusiasm at all. In fact, much of the novel appeared quite ridiculous to him. Fielding was not in the least charmed by the plot structure of Pamela. Far from it, in fact, he found the underlying absurdities quite humorous, and he also thought that the downright artfulness of the heroine was getting paraded as a form of virtue. And he was also disgusted by the author's Richardson's overwrought sentimentalism. So Fielding wanted to respond to this in some form or the other, and also capitalize on the success that Richardson had already reaped through Pamela. So he decides to take advantage of the popularity of Pamela, and initially he published an anonymous satirical skit titled Shamela, obviously parodying Pamela. This was in 1741, and at a later point around this time he is also said to have started writing Jonathan Wild the Great, which was published only much later in 1743. But however, the event that marked an instant success for Henry Fielding was the publication of The Adventures of Joseph Andrews in 1742, which was a direct parody of the novel Pamela by Samuel Richardson. The Adventures of Joseph Andrews could be classified as a burlesque, and in his own words, it was the intention was to raise an honest laugh against Pamela. So in Joseph Andrews, we find Fielding reversing the situation in Pamela, and he continues this parody until almost the 10th chapter. And in Joseph Andrews, the hero of the same name, he is also supposedly Pamela's brother in the fiction. And this hero is tempted by his mistress, and and just like Pamela resisted the advances of her master, we find Joseph Andrews resisting the advances of his mistress. So he also uses this parody as a device for making fun of male chastity, and also mockingly engages with heavy moral issues. But however, after the 10th chapter, we do not find him continuing with the same plot structure. he perhaps loses interest in the parody, and we find Fielding transforming his work into an epic of the highway, which is full of adventures, horseplay, and even not too decent fun. This work was experimental in nature, so was most of the earlier novels of the 18th century, but this work especially helped Fielding to lay foundations to his own craft and technique, and also form a peculiar, or also develop his own style of writing. The success of Joseph Andrews prompted Fielding to produce the next one, The Adventures of Tom Jones, in 1749. This, unlike the earlier work, it was set against an enormous canvas, so it was really a vast and expansive work. So the hero, titled Tom Jones, is a foundling in this work and who tramps up London in quest of fortune. So in the first part, this hero is living in the countryside, and we find Fielding talking about countrymen and manners. And in the second part, after the hero reaches London, we find a portrayal of metropolitan men and women. And in the second part, once the hero reaches the city of London, we find a portrayal of the metropolitan men and manners. So altogether, both the parts put together, the entire book gives the fullest and richest picture of English life and manners of the late 18th century. In that sense, it's also interesting as a historical document, so to speak. This work was not as this work in general was not considered as successful as his earlier work, but however, we do find some of the later writers such as Coleridge and Thackeray showering a lavish praise on Tom Jones, but later historians do feel that this sort of praise showered on this work was wildly extravagant. Fielding also wrote another novel which was more female centric. This was in 1751. It could also be seen as a kind of a response, and an antithesis to Richardson's Clarissa. In Emilia, we find the courage and patience of a devoted wife and the ill doings of a weak-willed husband, thereby also giving a lot of primacy to the female protagonist. But this work, unfortunately, it was sadder, less vigorous and less humorous. It also failed to make the kind of impact that Joseph Andrews and to a certain extent Tom Jones had left. And this was also not much of a success either literarily or financially. Fielding's writing style was much different from any other writer of the earlier times, or even compared to his contemporaries. He could leave a very distinct mark in the writing style. He was more concerned about the structural principles of prose fiction. In that sense, he was also unlike Defoe or Richardson, who believed that one need not stick to any kind of rigid writing rules, especially when one is writing in prose or writing a novel. So, but for Fielding, novel was just like an epic or a drama, which should also follow a particular certain form and certain principles in terms of composition, in terms of structure, in terms of treatment, etc. Fielding also was a moralist in his own way, though he was not exactly like Richardson. He repudiated Richardson's pinched ideas of conduct, but nevertheless he did offer his own kind of satire in his own teaching in his writings. And we find that one of his objectives, also quite similar to Richardson, was to expose some of the most glaring evils, as well public as private, which at present infect the country. He also, like Richardson, thought that he had the responsibility to purify and modify the English society. In terms of his art and technique, he was a greater artist than Richardson. He was also considered by later historians as truer and healthier in comparison to his contemporaries. Many later critics and historians have sought to undertake a comparison between Richardson and Fielding, because both of them were equally important in laying the foundations of English novel in the 18th century. Richardson, as we have noted earlier, he belonged to a lower middle class family. He had very limited schooling. He did not go to a university, and his beginnings were from poverty, we do find him flourishing as a printer in London. And the turning point in his literary career was when two of his publisher friends asked him to compose an elementary letter writing manual. And in his works, we find a tendency to shift towards the sentimental, which also appealed to the reader's fancy during those times. In contrast, Fielding was born to a very well connected but an impoverished army officer, and he was also educated at London. There is this interesting anecdote about which also talks a lot about the kind of education that Fielding received, and also about the immense pride that he had on his family lineage. On being asked why his spelling was a little different from that of the from that of the conventional spelling of those times. If you notice, Fielding always spelled his name with F-I-E, whereas the prevalent spelling during those times was F-E-I when it came to Fielding. So, when asked about this peculiar kind of spelling that he retained as a surname, Fielding is said to have reported that Fielding is said to have responded that my branch of the family were the first that knew how to spell. So, this was the kind of intelligent arrogance this man possessed. We also find Fielding turning to the stage for a living for a brief time, though he did not leave much of a reputation over there. But however, the Licensing Act forced him to leave theatre and to move to law, journalism and writing, which also proved to be a turning point in his literary career. And unlike Richardson, we also find him focusing not on the sentimental but on the goodness in feeling. This is reflected in almost all of his works throughout. Moving on to the next most important writer of the period, Tobias Smollett. He lived from 1721 till 1771. He was of Scottish origin, and it also reminds us that Scottish Enlightenment did continue to play a significant role in the shaping of English literature in the 18th century. Smollett was trained as a surgeon. He was also a man of war. Since he was also quite well versed in naval expeditions, he is said to have had a first-hand knowledge of the sea and of sailors, and also of the appalling conditions of the naval service which prevailed in England during those times. He, in that sense, is considered as the real creator of the English novel of the sea and of sailors. He also systematically exploited the national peculiarities of people with different origins, such as Irish, Scotch and Welsh. This was also immensely appreciated by the English public, because there was an ongoing different kind of a relationship between all these inhabitants of the Great Britain. Smollett's life could be compared in minor ways with that of Goldsmith, because like Goldsmith, we find Smollett also turning to literature because he did not want to continue practicing medicine, in which he was trained in. He also worked for a while as a hack writer with a miscellaneous bookseller. He also had produced a number of books during those times which were obviously not named after him. What inspired him to begin writing novels during that time was the instant success that Richardson and Fielding reaped in England during those times. So, inspired by this, we find Smollett on a writing spree, and he produced almost half a dozen novels, and for him novel was just a large diffused picture. We do not find him making any deliberate attempt to organize his materials into an artistic whole, because he, like many others of those times, believed that the novel need not be structured or need not follow any kind of principles, because there was no precedence, or there was no particular model for anyone to follow. Roderick Random, published in 1748, is perhaps the most famous and the most important work of Smollett's. In this, he portrays a hero's journey from being a penniless outcast to a surgeon's apprentice and then to a sailor. So, there is this particular hero who continues to have different kinds of varying experience in his life. He suffers in battle, he is kidnapped, he is also forced to serve a sentence in prison. He also falls into utmost despair. So, we find that this work was immensely popular during those times, not just because of the variety of experiences that it hosted, also because of the way in which it dared to address certain subjects which were considered taboo until then. So, in that sense, this work also celebrates the emergence of a certain sexual openness in English society. And for example, Smollett undertakes a not totally serious defense and even an open invitation to homosexuality. We find that there is a certain reference to the subject of homosexuality even in Swift's Gulliver's Travels. So, all of these were controversial, and at the same time people were more open to newer ideas and debating about newer kinds of tendencies, because the 18th century was all about reason, rationality, and also making oneself available to newer kinds of experiences. And the work of Roderick Random was particularly significant in the national history of England, because since he had portrayed the great sufferings that the sailors were forced to undergo when they were out in the sea, This really influenced certain policy changes, and it said that it led to drastic changes for the betterment of naval service conditions, not just in Britain but also in certain parts of Europe. The success of Roderick Random was followed by The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, published in 1751. But again, another important work was published in 1771, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker. This work is considered as the first state of the nation novel. In this one, we find a family trying to achieve harmony and trying to achieve the state of utopia, which they locate in Scotland as a Scottish paradise. And in this work, we also see this ongoing tussle between England and Scotland. We also see that Smollett is again one of many Scottish writers who try to leave a lasting imprint on English writing, but by also including a detailed portrayal of life, manners, geography, and everything about Scotland. In this work, The Expedition of Humphrey Clinker, there is a detailed description about Scotland, and particularly the reference to Glasgow is very interesting. It's Glasgow is introduced as one of the prettiest towns in Europe, one of the most flourishing in Great Britain. This also reflects upon the heights that Scotland's mercantile activities had achieved then, and also about a very pointed reference towards the events of Scottish Enlightenment. When we look at the kind of stories that Smollett produced, keeping in mind that he had produced almost half a dozen novels, most of his stories were stories of high-spirited young men. They dealt with harsh realities of life. He also engaged with polemical satire and controversial debates in his writings. His works in general could be classified under this term picaresque novels, the same term which could be used for works such as Tom Jones as well. A picaresque novel is a novel which takes its hero or heroine on a journey or through a series of events and misadventures, out of which he or she emerges triumphant. The term is derived from Spanish, in which picaro means rogue. So, a picaresque novel is also the kind of novel which talks about a hero who survives on wit and presence of mind amidst unfavorable circumstances. So, altogether it is not a negative portrayal of the picaro or the rogue, but also a humorous and entertaining depiction of the life of a picaro. The picaresque novels also include novels of trickery and on rogues, and Smollett's work, though it could be compared in many levels with Fielding and that of Richardson's, it was also considered at a lower level than that of his contemporaries. And in terms of, when we talk about his personal life, it said that eventually he retired to Italy, where he dies, and he was buried there as well. Smollett also wrote some non-fiction. For instance, The Complete History of England, published in 1757-58. It was a huge success in terms of the revenue that it generated, but nevertheless it was also controversial because of some of the inputs that he provided, and he also was forced to serve a brief sentence in prison. He also had published Travels Through France and Italy in 1766, and also The Present State of All Nations in 68-69, which was an immense and complex work and also considered as one among the best works of the 18th century. So, led by these great stalwarts such as Richardson, Fielding and Smollett, England had become a very fertile ground for the production of novels. There was also a growing reading public who were waiting for the next edition to come out. So, in multiple ways, England was also emerging as the land in which novel as an art form not just emerged but also reached its perfection. We shall continue to look at the impact of 18th century novel in English writing and as well as in world literature in the coming sessions. That's all we have for today. Thank you for listening and look forward to seeing you in the next lecture.